The file on Marcus Webb was 11 pages long. Vrakk had read longer briefings on sitting heads of state. He read it twice anyway in the back of the transit pod as the city scrolled past the rain-streaked window, because he was thorough by both nature and profession, and because 11 pages was the kind of thinness that deserves scrutiny. A target that generated this much institutional confusion while occupying this little space in the official record was either a non-entity who had gotten very lucky 3 times in a row or something the Dominion's intelligence apparatus did not have adequate vocabulary to describe. The file said, Marcus Webb, age 41, nationality, British Earth, classification, civilian, title, UN Liaison Officer, grade 7, Office of Emerging Civilizational Contacts, current salary in Earth currency translated to something that, by Dominion standards, would not cover the operational budget for a mid-sized surveillance post. Dietary notation, fond of pasta, no criminal record, no military service, no financial irregularities, 2 speeding violations in a vehicle he apparently no longer owned. The section labeled Pressures, Vickers, the part of any file Vrakk read first, the part that told him how a target was going to behave when the walls started closing, contained 4 words, no clear leverage identified. Vrakk had closed the file at that point and looked out at the rain for a while. 4 analysts had touched this file. He could see their notes in the margins of the digital copy, layered like sediment. The first was clinical, confident. The second was confused. The third had written, in the shorthand of someone who had run out of professional language, subject does not appear to process threat correctly. The fourth had simply highlighted the 3 annexation failure dates and added a single question mark. 4 analysts. 11 pages. 14 months of operational failure. Vrakk had handled the deputy governor of the Veth Confederation, a man who had 7 separate intelligence agencies protecting him and the personal loyalty of a private army. He had resolved that situation in 9 days. He had been the deciding instrument in the collapse of the Mareth Coalition, a political entity that had survived 4 centuries of galactic upheaval. He had once, and this remained his quietest professional satisfaction, ended a war between 2 systems by having a carefully calibrated conversation with one specific accountant. It never once produced a file with a question mark in it. He rolled his broad shoulders once, feeling the smooth weight of his hide settling. He would be at the apartment in 20 minutes. He would give this 2 hours, perhaps 3, and then Marcus Webb's career as an obstacle would conclude, one way or another, through whatever mechanism the situation made available. Vrakk was adaptable. He always found a mechanism. The building was precisely as unremarkable as its occupant. 3rd floor, end of corridor. The kind of hallway that smelled of cooking and old carpet in approximately equal measure. Vrakk moved quietly. He always moved quietly, and stopped in front of the door at the end of the hall. There was a small handwritten sign affixed to it. Block letters, blue ink, no colge, collars. This means you, Gregor. Vrakk stared at the sign for a moment. He did not know who Gregor was. He was, technically, a cold caller by any reasonable definition, though the purpose of his call was somewhat outside the sign's apparent intended scope. He noted precisely and involuntarily that the sign made him feel as though he had already made an error of some kind, which was both irrational and faintly irritating. He knocked. The door opened in less time than it should have, someone who had been close to it waiting, and there was Marcus Webb, 5'10", slightly soft around the middle in the way of someone who spent significant time at a desk, football jersey in a shade of red and white, the logo of a team Vrakk's briefing notes had not covered, holding a fork. Behind him, the warm smell of something tomato-based and the sound of a television with the volume turned low. He looked at Vrakk, all 2.2 meters of him, gray-black hide and 4 eyes and the particular stillness of a Kraalveth at rest, and his expression did exactly none of the things expressions were supposed to do. No fear, no startled recoil. Something that might have been, if Vrakk was reading it correctly, mild recognition. "Yeah," Marcus Webb said. "I've been expecting someone. Come in. I've got pasta on." Vrak's hide shifted. just slightly. The microscopic scales rising at the back of his neck, the surface texture going from matte to faintly crystalline in a way that was invisible to humans and deeply annoying to him. He had prepared in the transit pod for 7 distinct opening scenarios. None of them had involved pasta. He went inside. The living room was the kind of space that communicated everything about its occupant in the first 10 seconds. Vrakk read rooms the way he read files, thoroughly and with attention to what wasn't supposed to be visible. What he saw was documents, stacked on every surface, printed and annotated, the margins dense with handwriting in 3 different ink colors. A whiteboard mounted on the wall to his left, covered in text so dense it had required a second board to be propped against the first, and both were full. He could read Galactic Charter notation from 4 meters. He could read it from here. He made himself not catalog the specific clauses immediately, because that impulse felt, suddenly, like a trap. A laptop on the table, lid open, multiple tabs visible. Vrakk clocked the tab titles without meaning to. Galactic Charter Article 7, Subsection 12. Kraalveth Annexation. Precedence 2022-823231, a translation tool. A live document with the cursor blinking in it. Marcus was already moving toward the kitchen. "Sit down if you like." "Tea?" Vrakk said. He did not comment on the tea. He looked at the whiteboard again, and then at the corner of the window where something small and brown was suspended in an architecture of silk that caught the lamplight. "That's Gerald," Marcus said, returning with 2 mugs he hadn't been asked to produce. "He's been there about 4 months. Good for flies." He set a mug in front of Vrakk, without asking if Kraalveth drank tea, which they did not, and settled into the chair across from him with the ease of someone taking a seat in their own living room, which, technically, this was. "So, what's the Dominion calling it this time? Cultural outreach? Voluntary integration process?" The acoustic membranes along Vrack's jawline gave one small, involuntary flutter. He stilled them. "I represent certain interests," he began, and his voice was what it always was. Measured, precise, faintly warm in the way that a well-calibrated instrument could be warm. Interests that have found the recent pattern of procedural obstruction originating from this office to be the Galactic Charter complaints. Yeah, Marcus wrapped both hands around his mug. 37 separate filings. 41 if you count the supplemental amendments. "I've got copies of all of them if you want to go through them. I'd actually appreciate a fresh set of eyes on the Article 9 submission. I think the Velthari translation might have an error in Clause 4, but my Velthari is conversational at best." Vrack's secondary eyes dilated. He kept his primary gaze steady and professional, but the peripheral pair went wide in the dark of the room in a way he was aware of and could not correct. The target was not countering him. The target was treating his professional approach as an opportunity to discuss translation accuracy. He recalibrated. "The interests I represent," he said more carefully, "are capable of ensuring that your continued activities in this capacity become complicated. There are mechanisms available to ensure that the appropriate authorizations for this office's operations are reviewed, revisited, potentially not renewed." Marcus nodded. He had the expression of someone listening to a thing they've already heard and filed correctly. "Which provision of the Galactic Charter are you citing for that?" "Because Article 14, Section 3 protects the function of recognized diplomatic liaisons from interference by non-governmental entities, and the Dominion's Intelligence Division is categorized as non-governmental under the Brella Accords, which you signed in." He paused, tilted his head slightly. 2287. I think. "I can check." "You don't need to check. I like to be accurate." The silence had a specific texture. Vrakk had been in many silences. This one felt, in a way he couldn't quite anatomize, like the other person in it, was more comfortable than he was. He picked up his tea, realized he'd done it, and set it back down without drinking it. His claws had extended slightly. He placed his hand flat on the table. He shifted approach. He described in careful, layered language the kind of considerations that tended to weigh on people in positions like Marcus's. Concerns about institutional support, about whether the four-person office would survive the next budget review, about what life looked like on the other side of a career that had attracted this level of attention. He did not use the word threat. He never used the word threat. He spoke in the grammar of implication, which he had spent decades perfecting. Marcus listened. He was a good listener, attentive, unhurried, the kind of stillness that came from genuine engagement rather than politeness. And then his phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it, and something crossed his face that might have been mild amusement. "We're at about 2.3 million viewers," he said. Vrakk's breathing stopped. "The comment section is..." Marcus turned the phone, briefly so the screen faced Vrakk. A streaming platform, live, chat scrolling faster than comfortable reading pace. Mostly people who think this is a creative project. Someone's asking what kind of pasta it is. A few people seem to recognize you, though, so... He set the phone down. "I filed the stream as a formal diplomatic communication under Article 22 before you knocked. Everything we've said is already on record with 7 oversight bodies in the Valthari embassy who were kind enough to act as neutral witnesses." Vrakk did not move. He had not taken a breath in 11 seconds. His hide was doing the crystalline thing across both shoulders now, the scales risen and catching the lamplight in a way he was certain Marcus, if he looked closely, would notice. The claws under his right hand were pressing into the table surface with a pressure that stopped just short of leaving marks. Everything he had said for 40 minutes was public record. He exhaled, slowly, and felt the room reconstitute around him. There was a period, professional, controlled. He had been in worse situations than this. What he was in now was a situation that required adjustment, not retreat. He filed the new parameters and worked with them. He received the transmission from Admiral Shreathvale while Marcus was in the kitchen briefly replenishing something. Vrakk could hear the precise sounds of domesticity, a kettle, a cupboard, the particular silence of a person who lived alone being comfortable in their space. The Admiral's face on the small private display was the face of someone who had been awake too long. "Stop managing this," the Admiral said. The word resolve carried weight that did not need elaboration. Vrakk acknowledged the transmission and put it on hold. Marcus returned, and at that moment, as though the evening had arranged itself for maximum inconvenience, his phone rang. Not the streaming platform, a personal call. He looked at the screen and something in his face changed, not into anything complicated, just into something more ordinary, and he said sorry a second, took the call. Vrakk watched. "Hey, Yenna." A pause. "Yeah, I did eat pasta." A longer pause. I know. I will." The voice from the phone was tinny and warm and too quiet for Vrakk to make out the words precisely, but the cadence was familiar across species, the particular rhythm of someone who cared enough to check on a person. "Sleep? Yeah, I'll sleep. Go watch your thing. I'll call you Thursday." Marcus hung up and looked at Vrakk and picked up the conversation from exactly where they'd left it, without gap or adjustment, and Vrakk, who had been looking, while Marcus was on the phone, at the photos on the wall behind him. The row of frames above the stacked documents found that he was looking at a different file than the one he'd read in the transit pod. A woman with Marcus's eyes, laughing at something outside the frame. A group photograph at what appeared to be some kind of community gathering. Marcus in the middle, a dog inexplicably on his shoulders. A child's drawing, framed with the same care as the photograph, of a figure that might charitably be described as a person, and below it, in uncertain letters, "Uncle Marcus saves the world." Vrakk made himself look away from the drawing. He understood now the note in his analyst's report. Subject does not appear to process threat correctly. This was not a clinical observation. It was a failure of framework. The analyst had been trying to describe something they didn't have words for. "You understand," Vrakk said, and he put down the professional framing deliberately, because it wasn't working, and also, he found, because it felt inappropriate, what the Dominion is capable of. "You understand that this is not a filing problem. This is not something that resolves through paperwork." Marcus looked at him for a moment, and then he said, "Yes." and his voice had dropped a register and gotten very precise in the way that Vrakk understood was not calculation, but the opposite of calculation. It was the voice of something real. Yes, I do understand that. He did not say it with bravado. He said it the way a person states a fact they have already made peace with, which was, Vrakk realized with a slow and uncomfortable shift in his chest, not the same as not being afraid. The man was afraid. The fear was present. Vrakk could read it in the slight tightening around the eyes, the hands that had stopped moving as naturally as they had an hour ago. He was afraid, and he had decided that being afraid and doing this anyway were not in conflict, and he had apparently made that decision long enough ago that it had become structural. Vrakk pressed himself backward in the chair, just slightly. He caught himself doing it and disliked it intensely. The approach had failed, not because Marcus was clever, though he was, in the specific, unglamorous, thoroughly documented way of someone who had read everything and discarded nothing, and not because he had outmaneuvered Vrakk in any particular exchange. It had failed because it required, at its foundation, a lever, something that could be moved, and Vrakk had been looking all night for the lever, and he was beginning to understand that what he was sitting across from was not a wall or a locked door, but simply a person who had already accounted for the weight and decided they could carry it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, genuinely, "What do you actually want?" Marcus considered this with the same attentiveness he'd given everything else. "I want the Dominion to leave Earth alone long enough for us to figure out what we are before someone decides for us." He paused. "We're still working that out. The figuring out part. We've been at it a while." A small, self-deprecating pull at the corner of his mouth. "We're not good at it, but we should get to do it ourselves." Vrakk found, after a moment, that he had a question. A real one, not a professional tool. "And what does the Dominion actually want?" He watched Marcus carefully. "Not the official position, not the justification for filing. What is it, do you think?" The silence stretched. Marcus was giving the question the consideration it deserved, which was, Vrakk noted, more consideration than most people would have extended to their would-be silencer in hour 3 of an unplanned conversation. "Expansion," Vrakk said before Marcus could answer. He said it because, for the first time in longer than he could conveniently remember, he was being asked to say it plainly, and the word was already there. Resources, the logic of it. If we stop growing, something else grows instead. The Dominion has 11 systems because it stopped being able to imagine a version of itself that didn't require 12. That is simply what it is. Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at Vrakk with an expression that Vrakk did not initially have a category for, because in 41 years of professional operation he had never been looked at this way by a target. It was not contempt. It was not satisfaction. It was a kind of clear, steady sorrow, the emotion of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed and finds no pleasure in having been right. "I find that sad," Marcus said, simply, without inflection that made it a weapon. Vrakk sat with that for a moment. He had been called dangerous. He had been called ruthless and effective and precise by people who meant those things as compliments. He had been called a monster twice by people who meant it as a curse. He had never been found sad. He discovered, sitting in the lamplight of a small, untidy apartment with a spider named Gerald and 41 Galactic Charter filings on the whiteboard, that being found sad was somehow worse than all of it, because it was accurate. He looked at the Admiral's transmission, still on hold. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Marcus Webb, who had gone back to his pasta at some point, cold now, but he seemed unbothered, and was reading something on his laptop with the focused, unhurried concentration of a man who fully intended to still be doing this tomorrow. Vrakk thought about what he had been sent here to resolve. He thought about Counselor Braitha Mala of the Galactic Oversight Commission, whose name he had known for 8 months, who had been asking quiet questions about the Dominion's Earth operations that no one had answered yet. He thought about what a comprehensive and thoroughly documented report, filed from within the Dominion's own intelligence apparatus, might do to those questions. He did not make the decision dramatically. He was not a dramatic person. He simply understood, with the clarity that comes from a career spent reading people exactly as they are, that he had made it somewhere between the live stream reveal and the phone call from the sister, and that the rest of the evening had been the settling of something already done. He stood. He was very large in the small room, and Marcus looked up from the laptop and tilted his head slightly. "You're going," Marcus said. "Yes." "Okay." Marcus didn't get up. "Look, I don't know what you're going to put in your report. I know what I'm going to put in mine. Whatever you do with the Dominion side of things, that's yours to figure out." Vrakk looked at him for a moment. "The live stream," he said. "The filings, the preparation." He gestured slightly at the whiteboard, the stacked documents, the spider in the corner. "None of this is the job they pay you for." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's the job." He seemed to understand the difference. He seemed to have understood it for quite some time. Vrakk left without further ceremony. In the corridor, he passed the door sign again. "No cold callers, this means you, Gregor," and did not stop. He walked down the stairs and through the lobby and out into the wet street and stood there for a moment, feeling the rain on his hide, the droplets running in the small channels between his scales. He sent the Admiral a brief message. "Situation is resolved." The Admiral would interpret that however he chose. In the morning, Vrakk would clarify. The report took him 6 hours to compose. It was, by the standards of his career, the most careful document he had ever produced. He had access to 41 exhibits. Marcus's filings had done much of the work already, and his own operational records provided the rest. He addressed it to Councillor Braithamala of the Galactic Oversight Commission, Office of Territorial Conduct, and he filed it through a channel the Admiral did not have visibility on, and he sent it at 3 in the morning while the rain was still coming down. Then he sat in the dark for a while and thought about a man in a football jersey who read every word of everything and forgot nothing that mattered, and had apparently, at some point in the last 14 months, decided that the size of the risk was not a factor in whether to take it. The consequences for Vrakk moved quickly, as consequences tended to when they were waiting. The Admiral was not a man who expressed anger simply, but he was efficient in his response. There were formal proceedings, and then there were informal proceedings, and then there were several meetings of the kind that do not appear in any official record, and Vrakk attended them all with the particular calm of someone who has already decided that the outcome is the outcome. He did not defect. He was not, in any formal sense, a traitor. He had simply filed a report with the appropriate oversight body, which was a thing that was technically permitted and which everyone in the Dominion's intelligence apparatus understood you were supposed to never do. He was told by a contact in the Commission that a package had arrived from Earth in Kraalveth formal script. He found this interesting enough to collect it personally. The note inside was formatted with grammatical precision that would have satisfied his own academy instructors. The formal greeting was exactly correct. The closing notation was exactly correct. The single line of content between them read, "Gerald the spider says hello." Vrakk's acoustic membranes did something they did not often do. They fluttered quietly in the empty office for a long time after he set the note down. He had spent 41 years understanding people in the way that makes people useful, as systems with predictable inputs and manageable outputs, as combinations of want and fear that could be mapped and navigated. He had been very good at it. He remained, technically, very good at it. What he had not been prepared for, and what he kept returning to in the days after, in the particular way that thoughts return when they have found something worth revisiting, was the moment he had read Marcus Webb correctly, not as a target, as a person. He had done what he always did, looked clearly, assessed accurately, understood the subject as they actually were. And what he had understood was a man who stress ate pasta and worried about his sister and named spiders and had, at some point in 14 unremarkable months, quietly decided that the 8 billion people behind him deserved someone who would read every word, file every form, answer every door, and not once calculate whether the cost to himself was a cost worth bearing. Not because Marcus wasn't afraid, not because he was naive, But because he had decided who he was somewhere along the way, and the deciding had been so complete and so settled that there was simply nothing left in it to use. No gap between what he believed and what he did. No space between the person and the position. Vrakk had spent his career finding those gaps. Everyone had them. They were where the work got done. Some people, he was coming to understand, did not have them. Not because they were invulnerable, but because they had already paid the price of having them closed. Had paid it quietly, probably, in years of inadequate sleep and a budget smaller than a parking division's and cold pasta and a sister who didn't know the full shape of what her brother was doing. And they had kept going anyway, and the going had made them into something that his professional vocabulary did not have a word for. The most dangerous person in any room was not the one with the most power or the most cleverness or the most willingness to use violence. He knew that now with a certainty that felt less like a lesson and more like a recalibration of something fundamental. The most dangerous person was the one who had already decided who they were, completely, without remainder. Because there is nothing left to threaten when the deciding is done.